Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome to a brand new video. My name is Arfat, and in today's video, I'd like to share with you the history of early Christianity, focusing more on the sources that we have available. When it comes to the study of early Christian history, our sources is not as great as compared to later history of Christianity. For example, during the time of Reformation, during the time of Islam, so on and so forth. And that is because not only does the sources actually matters, the quality of the sources matters much more. When it comes to the history of early Christianity, the sources that we have are the New Testaments, as well as the Greco-Roman writings, for example, from Josephus, who was a Jew in the first century, as well as Tacitus, and so on and so forth, who was a pagan living in the Roman Empire. But when it comes to the New Testament, which will be our focus of today, a lot of scholars and a lot of laymen actually have tended to focus on just the Gospels. But recently, scholars have actually advised the masses to actually look at the entire New Testament, because the entire New Testament actually gives us clues as to how the community of Christians, so-called Christians in the first century actually evolved. And to this, we have to actually look at our sources chronologically. And if you look at the New Testament today, if you open the New Testament, you are greeted with the Gospel of Matthew. But Matthew is not actually the first sources to be written that later on became Christian scripture. Scholars are of the unanimous opinion of the scholars of the consensus that the writings of the Apostle Paul was actually the first writings when it comes as far as our chronology is concerned. And the gospel authors who penned down Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have actually been influenced by the writings of the Apostle Paul. And this we can find if we actually analyze passages by passages and compare and contrast as to what Paul thought about Jesus as to what the gospel authors have actually placed at the lips of Jesus. One of the common things that you'll see is that the common teachings of Paul is that Paul knew nothing except Jesus and Him crucified. And we find echoes of this in the scripture, so on and so forth, especially in Matthew, Mark, not so much in Luke, for various reasons, which if you look at the commentaries, because Luke and Paul actually got into a dispute much later on. And so the historical Luke could have probably not wanting anything to do with Paul. But again, his writings have also been influenced by the Apostle Paul. But when it comes to the writings of the Apostle Paul, as far as our chronology is concerned, we also have to be very careful, because not all writings of Paul as portrayed in the New Testament is actually attributed to Paul. Scholars like Raymond Brown, Bart Ehrman, Dale Martin, so on and so forth, are of the opinion that the authentic sources, or at least these writings, can be confidently attributed to the Apostle Paul. These are 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Philemon, Galatians, what's the other one? Philippians. And so, as well as Romans. And so these are the writings that we can confidently attribute to the Apostle Paul. As far as the writings of Ephesus, as well as the other writings, the pastoral epistles, all these are pseudo-Paul, which basically means they are later writings ascribed or attributed to the Apostle Paul. And this we find because if we analyze the vocabularies, and if we actually look at the words that are being used, as well as the message, these are actually different from the writings of the Apostle Paul, the authentic Paul. So you can actually establish writings. If you group them together, you'll find that they share similar teachings, theology, vocabulary, as well as all the other writings that actually are not able to fit into all these groups. I think earlier on I mentioned 2nd Thessalonians, but correction, 2nd Thessalonian is also pseudo-Pauline. And so only First Thessalonians can be confidently attributed to the Apostle Paul. When it comes to the Gospel, for example, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, scholars are of the opinion, very strong opinion, whereby the Gospel of John is actually the last Gospel to be included or to actually be penned down. If you compare it to the Synoptic Gospels from the Greek Synoptikos, which basically means you can actually view them together. They share similarities, a lot more similarities as compared to the Gospel of John. And so, especially Matthew and Mark. Matthew actually uses 90% of Mark, as compared to Luke, which only uses about 60 to 70% of Mark. So majority of the content in Mark can also be found in Matthew's Gospel. And so we also turn to the Gospel of John as well as the epistles of John, the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. These were not written by the same John. The epistles of John were not written by the author who actually penned down the Gospel of John, which according to Christian fundamentalists were actually written by the Apostle John, son of Zebedee. It has also been noted in Raymond Brown's commentary that it is John. This John is also called the beloved disciples. But it could not be the John that is famously known as John, the son of Zebedee. So this could be another John, so on and so forth. But without getting into the technicalities and the weeds, so how do we actually view the early history of Christianity? For example, within just the 1st century itself. And so this is actually a very complicated topic whereby hundreds of literatures have been written and a lot of different conclusions. But if you have read enough, you'll find that majority of the scholars are of the opinion that the early followers of Jesus, and in fact Jesus himself, they were actually Jews. They were not Christians. And if you actually look at the book of Acts, okay, Christians were called they were called Christians much later on. Okay, the group of people were called Christians much later on in the book of Acts. But as far as Jesus and his disciples, when Jesus preached in Capernaum, all around Nazareth, in Upper Galilee, and so forth, his ministries in ancient Palestine, he was actually preaching to the Jews. Occasionally, he would go, if you look at the Gospel of John, chapter 4, he would venture beyond the land of what we call Judea, and he would actually have a conversation with the woman at the Jacob's well. And so the Samaritan woman, according to scholars, Samaritans were actually not to be considered Jews, but nevertheless, the Samaritans actually subscribed to a kind of Judaism. And so much recent theory is that we have to not actually look at Judaism in the 1st century as a narrow strata or strand, whereby only people in ancient Palestine can be considered Jews. Because it is actually incorrect if we use the term Judaism of today to refer back to the people who subscribe to the teachings of Moses, the law, the Torah. Because today Jews, the word Jews refers to ethnicity as well as those who actually profess the religion of Judaism. But in the ancient world, the term is not used to denote a kind of ethnic group or ethnicity, because these are religious terms. And which is why we have the Samaritans who claim that they were actually Jews, even though they might not be ethnically Jews. And even the term ethnic Jews is actually very problematic, because what does it mean to be ethnic Jews, ethnically Jews? And so this is a very, very highly problematic word to use. But nevertheless, we should avoid anachronism, and we should actually look at how the people of the past, especially the people who believe in the laws of God as passed down to Moshe in Hebrew. They don't see themselves as ethnically Jews. They see themselves as religiously Jewish, if that makes sense. Okay, and so these are the terms which we will employ, its definitions we will employ to avoid being anachronistic. And so Jesus was a Jew, although this is problematic as well. Okay, and I've written an article arguing why Jesus wasn't a Jew, nor was the Hawariyun, the disciples of Jesus themselves, were actually Jews. But either way, you can find the articles in the community page of my YouTube channel, inshallah. And so when Jesus actually began to preach to his disciples, one of the earliest accounts in Mark chapter 1 verse 35 was that Jesus actually went to call out the first two of his disciples, okay, which is James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And so James and John, the son of Zebedee, actually left their father Zebedee in the boat because they were fishermen. And so they were now becoming, instead of fishing for fish in the Sea of Galilee, they are now to become the fishers of men, i.e., to call people to the good news, to call people to the gospel that has been taught by Jesus, okay, Jesus himself. And so this is how actually the early so-called Jesus movement actually began. Now we will not use the term early Christianity. We will not refer to the groups of people here as early Christians because it is actually incorrect. In fact, these were early groups of people who follow Jesus. Okay? If you also turn to the Gospel of John, which is a much later gospel, probably written around 95 or even 100 of the Common Era. The discourses of Jesus with the Samaritan woman at Jacob's well in chapter 4 indicates whereby that the Samaritans have been waiting for the Messiah, or at least portrays that the Jews have been waiting for the Messiah. Because if you, depending on how you look at it, because if you see the Samaritan as Jews as well, meaning they are also included in the greater Jewishness of the religion of Moses. And so it is also correct to say that even the Samaritans have been waiting for the Messiah. Okay, although we will not go there because it is problematic in itself. And so the Jews have been waiting for the Messiah, and so Jesus said that it is He who you are talking to. Basically, Jesus is telling the Samaritan woman that He is indeed the Messiah that the Jewish people have been waiting for. And so Jesus sees Himself as the Messiah, meaning the anointed one, from the Greek word Christos, Hebrew Mashiach. And so in Arabic it's Masih. And so Jesus portrays himself as the Messiah, the anointed one, the chosen one by God. Okay, and so Jesus carries with himself the Evangelion, the good news, and he preached the good news to the disciples, to his disciples first and foremost, or what later on became his disciples, as well as to the people in and around Galilee. For example, in Capernaum, Bethsaida, so on and so forth. And so that is how the early followers or the early Jesus movement actually began. If you look at the sources, for example, our gospel. And these sources, these narrations, is actually missing in the writings of the Apostle Paul. If the Apostle Paul, this has always baffled historians, even puzzled historians of early Christianity. If Paul so claimed that he has met the risen Jesus, and if Paul were there in the ministry, in the early ministries of Jesus, why was this writing absent from all his epistles combined? Paul only taught a few things about Jesus. Paul doesn't say that Jesus was born of a virgin, although Paul said that Jesus was born of a woman. Indeed, everyone was born of a woman, and so we can discard that. Paul never preached or wrote about the miracles that Jesus did. For example, raising Lazarus from the dead, healing leprosy, Paul never mentions any of the miracles that Jesus did, as well as the signs that the Gospel of John narrates. And so the teachings of Paul is not so much the teachings of Jesus. Instead, it is the teachings about Jesus. Paul reinterpreted what Jesus actually thought about himself. And instead of teaching or writing about what Jesus thought, he actually wrote about what Jesus is, or what he wrote of Jesus. Okay, and so Paul actually, according to the unanimous consensus of the historians, is not a first-person account of Jesus. And so Paul never met Jesus. And so Paul's writings doesn't show evidence that he actually know of Jesus. Okay, and so most probably Paul actually heard stories about Jesus, and he became believers in Jesus as well. Though this is not the opinion that I follow, but this is the opinion of majority of the historians. Okay, my opinion is that Paul actually wanted to be the Messiah. And so he wasn't chosen by God to be the Messiah. And so now he is in the mission to actually undo the works of the Messiah. That is my opinion. Okay? Because the book of Acts portrays Paul as trying to be a philosopher. He quotes pagan philosophy. And he himself was born in Tarsus, which is in modern day Turkey, south of Turkey, just between Syria and Turkey. And so he and those areas, if you look at the first century Greco-Roman world, they were filled with a lot of Hellenistic philosophy and ideas, as well as theology. Okay? Religious syncretism is what it's called. And so Paul wanted to be the Messiah, and so he wasn't the Messiah, and so now he wanted to preach about the Messiah in a way whereby he will also be acknowledged as the deliverance of the message of the Messiah. But a lot of people were not actually taking Paul seriously, because if you look at his writings, especially to the Corinthians and to the Galatians, okay, there were people sent from James, sent from Jerusalem, who actually counter the teachings of the Apostle Paul. For example, the teachings on circumcision. Okay, Paul in Galatians chapter 1 mentioned that since these people preach circumcision, okay, Paul actually hoped that the next time they actually undertake circumcision, that they will actually, cut off their, that part. And so these are the kinds of rhetoric that Paul employs. In another episode, whereby Paul says that in order to prove that he is also the apostle, okay, the apostle sent from God, he shows all these bruises that he has, and apparently this is evidence that he is actually the chosen one of God, or at least the one to carry on the message of the Messiah, the missionary activities, or the missionary for the Messiah. And so, but the people actually do not buy this. The men from James do not actually buy this. Now, eventually, if you look at the book of Acts portrays things much more differently as compared to the writings of the Apostle Paul himself, the authentic writings of the Apostle Paul. The book of Acts seems to show that the Jerusalem apostles, James and Peter and John even, they were all actually happy with Paul eventually, okay, and that they were all working together to spread the message of Jesus, the message of Jesus. But this is not so. If you actually read the writings of Paul, and remember the writings of Paul is way earlier as compared to the writings in the book of Acts. And so when it comes to historical sources, the earlier the sources, the much better the sources is. This is kind of the rule. Now, how accurate this rule is not actually accurate at all. You can find various reasons to actually disprove this so-called rule, but nevertheless, we have to also keep in mind that this is how history has been done throughout the years. But that doesn't mean that we should not refute the methodology behind it. But either way, a majority of the books that are written regarding the history of early Christianity do follow this kind of methodology. And no doubt this methodology is something which I don't fully adopt. But anyway, and so when we look at the book of Acts portrays that Paul and the Jerusalem apostles, Peter, James, John, even all other people, they were actually happy, and Paul and them actually spread the message of Jesus, and Paul spread the message to the Gentiles, and the Jerusalemites actually spread the message to other Jews, Jews who have yet to believe in the Messiah that has already come, because Jews continues to wait for the Messiah even today. But Jesus was the promised Messiah according to these early Christians, early followers of Jesus. And so they wanted to spread the message of Jesus, the good news. The Quran mentions the Injil. Yeah. And so either way, Paul in his actual writings was seen to be rubbing shoulders, not rubbing shoulders, to be in dispute with the apostles sent from Jerusalem. Now, we do not really know where the apostles came from. For example, in Galatians, super apostles, in Corinthians, all these super apostles. We do not actually know where these apostles or where these people came from that opposed the teachings of Paul. But most probably, they were sent from the Jerusalem apostles, okay, meaning the actual followers of Jesus, the one that actually walk and talk with Jesus, okay, and break bread with Jesus at the Last Supper. And so, when it comes to the early history of Christianity, these are pretty much what we know. Now, obviously, we can go on and describe a lot more, but these will all be in the realm of hypothesis, theory. But as far as what we can be certain of, this is basically what we know. Now, obviously, when we get to the 3rd century, the 4th century, we have writings of Eusebius of Caesarea. When it comes to the 5th century, we have writings of early church historians like Sozomenus, so on and so forth. And so these are all actually accounts that actually tend to recreate or reconstruct what happens in the 1st century. So does the scholars of today. With all the available sources, they try to reconstruct what actually happened, or what could probably happen, or what most likely seemed to have happened in the 1st century. Now, when in terms of chronologically, in terms of chronology, that is basically what we can confidently narrate. When it comes to teachings wise, the disputes in the teachings between the early Christians, how did the early followers of Jesus fare, or how did they respond to the ever-growing Gentile church? Okay, because a lot of non-Jews who were pagans, they were converted to the religion called Christianity by the Apostle Paul, because Paul went on all over the Greco-Roman world to preach the kind of message that he did in his writings, the message about Jesus, okay, not the teachings of Jesus. And so when the early followers of Jesus, they were surrounded by all these greater Gentile Christians who were not really the recipients of the message of Jesus. And so the teachings of Christianity or the teachings of Jesus have actually turned into a religion called Christianity, which Jesus himself did not ordain. And this is the opinion of majority of the early Christian historians or historians of early Christianity. As far as scholars like Paula Fredrickson, Charles Freeman, Louis Robert Wilken, as far as they are concerned in their writings, what eventually became Christianity were actually Gentiles who actually brought up this religion, and it has nothing to do with the followers of Jesus. Okay, the Quran calls the early disciples and companions of Jesus the Hawariyun. The Hawariyun, they were actually the first followers of Jesus. They were not considered the disciples of Jesus according to Tafsir ibn Kathir, and they were called Hawariyun because most probably because of the whiteness of their heart, or it could be probably because of the whiteness of their clothes, their robes that they wear. Okay, which is the Sufis. This is a tangent. We're going to tangent here. The Sufis sometimes refers to themselves as Ahlul Suf, which basically means the what material is that? That basically refers to the kind of materials that Jesus used to wear. Now, obviously, we do not know. This is all made up. We do not have sources that actually confirms that Jesus wear these materials. I forgot the name of it in English. But anyway, when we look at the writings of Hebrew, for example, we find that the teachings, or we find that Jesus has started to become somewhat divine. Okay, remember the book of Hebrews was written in the year 70, so this is before the Gospel of John was actually written. Obviously, the Gospel of John is much later on. We have the prologue whereby Jesus was actually turned to become part of the creator of the heavens, or creator of the earth, for example. Okay. But the book of Hebrews, we find the tendency whereby Jesus have been somewhat raised to the kind of divinity that will only allow much later theologians of the church to easily come out with the doctrine of the Trinity. Okay, basically the book of Hebrews paved the way for later theologians to carve out the doctrine of the Trinity in the 4th and 5th century. But as far as Matthew, Mark, and Luke is concerned, many occasions whereby Jesus actually prays to God. He prays to God in the morning and he prays to God in the evening. As what Epicandus in his book Judaism, Practice and Beliefs mentioned, that Jews actually pray twice a day in the 1st century. And so this is what Jesus used to do, as narrated in our gospel as well. And also the book of John as well, the Gospel of John. The Gospel of John, in John 17:3, Jesus actually informed the readers that there is only one true God, okay, and that Jesus is the one that has been sent by God, and so on and so forth. And so when it comes to words that have been attributed to Jesus at his own lips, this is actually, we find monotheistic beliefs. Okay, we do not find philosophical beliefs, we do not find paganistic ideologies, but we find beliefs that is similar to monotheism of the period. And so a lot of scholars are of the opinion whereby religious ideas actually were formed over a period of time, and we find that when we get from the gospel, the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, when we get to the Gospel of John, along with the writings of Hebrews and so forth, we find that there has been an increase in the Christology of Jesus. Christology of Jesus basically means the nature of Jesus. In what sense is he? Was he a human? He was a human from the beginning, and when we get to around the year 150, he has suddenly been elevated to the realm of the divine, though he is not ha theos. He is not the creator God, the creator of the heavens and the earth yet. This wasn't until much later on, the 4th and the 5th century. And so as far as our first century is concerned, even looking at the New Testament itself, if we actually arrange our sources chronologically, we began with the writings of Paul, then the Synoptic Gospels, the book of Hebrews, the Gospel of John, the epistles of John, so on and so forth. We find that there has been an incremental in the Christology of Jesus. So Jesus was first a man, and eventually he became Theos, or at least part of the triune Godhead. And so, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this brief narration actually provide you some interest to go and explore and research your own. And so, I'll see you in my next video. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.